All right, thank you for joining us for the August GATE Equity webinar, where we explore topics related to equity and graduation success. The webinar is posted on the GATE Equity webinar page if you want to follow along, and this is recorded so that you can read those captioned videos in the next couple of weeks. I'm Kathy Anderson, OSPI Graduation Equity Program Supervisor, and today's topic is why we drop out, English Language Arts Focus. We chose this topic because the authors joined us recently at a GATE advisory meeting, and we were so moved by the research that we thought more people should be aware of it and its implications. I'm joined today by two of the authors of Why We Drop Out, Deborah Feldman and Tony Smith. Superintendent Reichdahl has a 6-year K-12 vision with 3 phases, from small improvements to a full redesign. Our values guide our work here, and our measures of success are coming to you in a new redesigned report card. Today's topics are to introduce you to some of the major findings from the Why We Drop Out research, including some key transitions and triggers that might be helpful to address the schools near you. Before we begin, I want to highlight the usefulness of the Healthy Youth Survey. Healthy Youth Survey data is available to each school that participates and covers a wide range of topics that have implications for a school's climate. It'll be administered again this fall, and I want to encourage schools to participate so that they can look at risk factors like these. It's also available publicly to our community partners at www.askhys.net with statewide ESD or county data for a more global view. These results are from 2016 8th graders who are this year's sophomore class. As you can see, in 2016, 53% of 8th grade students said that they weren't completely looking forward to the future. 39% said that the things they are learning in school weren't going to be relevant later in their lives, and 50% reported feeling alone in life. These numbers are really troubling, in part because they're warning signs that students aren't getting the kind of support that they need. I'm joined today by the authors of Why We Drop Out, Deborah Feldman and Tony Smith, who studied students who dropped out of our K-12 system. They're going to share with us some of what they found as they worked with these students. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Well, thank you, and good morning, everyone. I'm Tony Smith, and I'm here with my colleague Deborah Feldman, and we're excited that you joined us so we can talk a bit about our study that led to the book, Why We Drop Out, Understanding and Disrupting Student Pathways to Leaving School. So let me switch to my screen here so we can continue. Okay.
Hi, this is Deborah Feldman, and about, well over 15 years ago, I was working on juvenile justice research, and I was tasked with listening to audio tapes of young people being interviewed by their probation officers about a number of factors in their lives. And I was supposed to be assessing how well the probation officers were doing with a new assessment tool, which was similar to Washington's assessment tool. But instead, I was totally captivated by the voices of these youths of all ages. And no matter what they had been arrested for, from shoplifting to more serious crimes, they all had really sad stories to tell about their school experiences. And at that point, I thought, these are really important voices that people need to hear. And that, it took a long time to finally get to a point where I found Tony and our other partner, Barbara, and we all felt the same, that youth voice was really missing from the research, and that it could add something important to our knowledge base about why students drop out.
So with that background and expertise, we designed a study that the purpose of which was to explore youth's perspectives on their school experiences from the very beginning of what they could remember. Oftentimes that was kindergarten, all the way through the time they dropped out, whether that was 8th grade, 9th grade, or later into high school. And so the 3 research questions that framed this study were, what can we learn from youth voice about the dropping out process? And then we also wanted to look at the institutional characteristics from the youth point of view to see how those were perceived by young people who are struggling in school and then who dropped out. And then finally, we wanted, of course, to bring hope to it in addition to Youth Voice by asking, so knowing these things from the perspectives of young people, what can schools, what can we all do to help divert these paths toward disengagement and dropping out? So with that in mind, we collected the stories through interviews with young people everywhere from south of Olympia, almost to the Canadian border to the north in Western Washington. We did enlist youth-serving organizations, a variety of them, to help us reach young people who had dropped out of school. And it was a diverse sample that matches the population at large. And we were cognizant of the different settings in which young people go to school. So we were determined to and were able to interview young people from rural, suburban, and urban settings. We ended up interviewing 53 young people ages 16 through 22 who had dropped out or had experienced serious truancy. And then the data collection involved a screening survey, a semi-structured interview that the purpose of which was to get the young people to talk about their experiences and to tell us their school and school-related stories from, as I mentioned before, very young in their school career up until the time they dropped out, and then from their current perspective, looking back on their school experience as a whole. And then we analyzed those data for salient themes and used narrative inquiry so that in the book, there are the complete stories in first person of 6 of the young people we interviewed, and those 6 represent the most prominent themes across all 53 participants we interviewed.
I actually wanted to add just one thing about, this was really an unusual study for a couple reasons. One is that the large sample, usually narrative inquiry is maybe 8, 5, 10 people. So this was a very large sample. Secondly, because we selectively picked partners of youth serving agencies who really serve different strands of the dropout population. So for example, we went to a locale that served homeless students. We went to GED program, and we also went to alternative schools, and this allowed us to get a much broader sample of youth than we might have otherwise. This is, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the broad findings. And one of the things we were really kind of surprised about is how much these youth really enjoyed their early elementary. And much later, they really don't. So this chart just shows that progression downwards. We had given them a chance to rate in a very general way their school experiences on a 1 to 5 scale across these different grade bands that you see at the bottom of your screen. And those that rated a 4 or 5 are the ones that we charted in this graph. So you can see in K through 2nd grade, we've got about 85% giving a favorable rating to their school experience as they reflected back on it. And then this sense of how I feel about school just drops precipitously, so that by the time you get to 9th and 10th grade, only about 20-some% had any kind of favorable feelings towards their school. That we would expect, given the population we were interviewing. Tony, did you want to comment on why we get a sudden uptick on 11 and 12?
Yes, yeah. So some of the youth we interviewed had, since the time they dropped out, become re-engaged, some of them in an alternative school program. And youth who were in that setting tended to see it positively. So the uptick between 9th and 10th and then 11th and 12th grade is due in part to those students who had dropped out and then re-engaged and had a favorable view of their current program.
Another important finding that we discovered by analyzing across these 53 different interviews was that youths tended to drop out in a fairly predictable pattern consisting of 4 phases. The first phase, they encountered some kind of initial disengagement from school, something that made them start to pull away from school, maybe not do their homework, maybe not pay attention in class, just not feel so great about school. And this could be from many different causes. Now, our study focused primarily on what was happening at school, but these youths were very forthcoming in telling us about all kinds of things that were going on, not just their academic issues. However, academic issues often played a major role in this first experience of pulling away from school. If no intervention occurs after this first phase, it kind of helps the student get back engaged with school, they will inevitably start skipping, usually in middle school. And this second phase is characterized by a more sporadic kind of skipping, often just one class, maybe a couple times a week. And then the students slide into phase 3, more serious truancy, where they're just skipping a lot. And then, of course, without any intervention that is effective for them, they will inevitably reach the 4th phase of dropping out, where they stop going to school altogether. And one thing interesting about phases 2 and 3 is that students can kind of move back and forth on this continuum sometimes. So we encountered a number of youths who told us about getting into very serious truancy and then kind of pulling back and maybe only skipping a little, and then in some cases just stop skipping altogether, but not for long. They return then to their skipping pattern and ultimately drop out. Another interesting pattern we saw was that across these 4 phases, there were 2 pretty distinct groups. One of them we called slow faders because they took a really long time from the time they first started skipping to the time they actually dropped out. And we knew from the research that dropping out is a process and not an event, but even so, we were astonished at how very long a number of these students could take to drop out. And this constituted a little bit over 1/3 of all the students we talked with. So for example, one student I remember so clearly started having problems in elementary school, started skipping in middle school, and yet clung on all the way to his super senior, his 5th year. And that was common of this group of slow faders, that they would last 3, 4, 5 years from the time when they first really started pulling away from school. Accelerated leavers were just the opposite. They accomplished all 4 phases in a pretty compressed time frame. So they also might start skipping typically sometime in middle school, late middle school, but within a year or 2 they were gone. And obviously these 2 groups of youths present very different issues for school personnel trying to effectively intervene. The slow faders have something that is keeping them attached to school, some kind of motivation to keep going, even half-heartedly, sort of 1 foot in and 1 foot out. So that motivation to keep going presents opportunities for the school, whereas the accelerated leavers are much more challenging, although we argue in the book that there are things schools can do even for kids that appear to be.
How similar are these young people's experiences to those of the students that you work with? And while we do that, we are going to take some questions. So if you do have questions for our presenters, we're ready to take those. And at the moment, we don't have any questions going on. And we're going to share these results. So you can see very similar is the largest category there. 74% said very similar. And I think we're going to get going.
Okay. Right, so we wanted to talk a bit about some initiating points that came up in the interviews with the young people. And they include this kind of range that you see on the slide. One is school environmental factors. Many of the young people enjoyed elementary school, but then when they transitioned to middle school, felt adrift or lost, and also mentioned a number of times that feeling of sort of just sitting in a classroom with peers you don't know and just being talked to. And so there was this sense of alienation that didn't seem to be widespread in elementary school, that in middle school then became a factor that for those who were academically vulnerable had a profound impact on their desire to attend class and attend school.
Peer group, where this showed up mostly amongst the 53 that we talked with, had to do with things like social ostracism and bullying. And we can talk some more about that, I think, a little later on, but bullying was a very prominent theme across a number of the youths we talked to, and made them not want to go to school.
Then academic difficulties, while of course some youth mentioned having academic difficulties in elementary school, that was not a widespread trend. It tended to emerge more in middle school and then beyond, sometimes with a single subject. And we'll talk in a little bit about some of the reading and writing and English language arts kinds of challenges that surfaced in kind of a fairly indirect way through our questioning. But in addition to some reading challenges, many students mentioned suddenly having extreme difficulties with mathematics, especially with Algebra 1, which some youth said, I just didn't understand it, and I don't get it, and I never will. And so that was one of the initiating points to skipping classes.
And in the classroom, going back again to the theme of middle school, there was this sense of these classes are too large and the teacher really doesn't know who I am, and or worse, doesn't really want to know me and in fact might be hostile towards me. Now, these are just the youth's perceptions, so we don't really know what went on in the classroom. But on top of those sort of perceptions of the teacher and the size of the class were issues around how material was being presented to them. And over again, students talked about how boring and difficult it was for them to become engaged if the teacher was just standing up and talking to them or giving them worksheets where they didn't really have any opportunity for active participation, active learning in what was going on. And I'm really stuck on the math part because I know that area better than the language arts. But boy, math was just this huge tripwire for students, in part because the manner in which it was taught necessitated them always staying on top of what was taught the day before, the week before, whatever. And if they didn't get an assignment, the forward-moving choo-choo train of the math class just would leave them completely behind. And I bet Tony's going to say some more later about language arts, but in any case.
Right. Well, that did have to do with that idea of growth mindset, and especially with the math. Failure on a test or on a semester of Algebra 1 seemed to rapidly confirm to the young people that no matter how hard they tried, they would simply never get it because they don't understand mathematics. So we'll come back to some of the other themes in a minute. Of course, family and personal factors, although we did not specifically ask about them, came up always. So one of the most dramatic ones was, of course, homelessness, and we did interview several homeless youth or who had been homeless at the time they stopped going to school. And it just seems very obvious, but one student was not able to complete her homework because she couldn't take the book home because she was homeless. And if she did try to take the book away from school and it was stolen or lost, then she would be responsible for replacing it, which was something she couldn't do. There was a range of other family factors, from parent separations to multiple moves, so the unstable housing situation with families moving around. And as we know from research, each move like that increases dramatically the risk of dropping out of school, to other factors such as encounters with the law, drug abuse, and pregnancy.
So this graphic is meant to just take a little bit deeper dive into how those learning issues connect with mindset, connect with withdrawal from school, and ultimately skipping and dropping out. So you start with some kind of negative learning experience or experiences. You form, as Tony was saying, some kind of notion about your intellectual abilities. And those of you who are familiar with Carol Dweck's work on growth mindset versus fixed mindset, this is where this comes in. Students who develop a fixed mindset about their abilities in whatever area, ultimately a common response is to withdraw their effort at precisely the time when more effort is needed or more support is needed. And what we get then is a cyclical reinforcement of all of each of these, because with poor outcomes that inevitably happen if you withdraw your effort, just reinforces the academic mindset, which reinforces the withdrawal. And what we found is that there was this very close connection between, me, the big takeaway is having the classroom teacher have a toolkit around how to deal with academic mindset.
Right. So I'll preview one example, and this is a language arts example specific to reading. And the negative learning experience in reading in middle school that a number of youth talked about as a catalyst for skipping was being asked to read aloud. And as a literacy person and researcher of literacy and working with teacher candidates who are becoming teachers of reading, I am still surprised and honestly dismayed that this practice persists, because students who struggle with reading, especially in middle school where they're so sensitive to social situations and shaming, to have a student who is not a fluent reader be asked to read aloud to the class is embarrassing. And there were young people who skipped classes specifically because they were afraid they would be asked to read aloud or had been asked to read aloud, and they fumbled when doing so. And as an aside, reading aloud, taking turns reading aloud, also defeats the purpose of reading, which is constructing meaning from text. And if you're focused on performance and practicing your paragraph so that you read it flawlessly, you're paying no attention to what the text is actually saying. So this was something that surfaced that frankly surprised me. I thought it was a practice that we had gotten rid of a long time ago. So then we get to the tipping points, and for the slow faders, they may take a long time getting to this point. For the accelerated leaver, it may happen very quickly. An example of the quick trip to the tipping point is pregnancy, and that young women tend still not to want to go to school when they're pregnant because of the social ramifications. And so stopping attendance is still pretty much what tends to happen.
Another precipitating factor for dropping out, and these are important just for school personnel to be aware of, that this is, if an event like one of these happens, then there is a strong possibility that the student is not going to come back to school. So expulsion and suspension, we found, as other researchers have found, that there often is a close connection between a disciplinary event and the student deciding not to come back to school. Similarly, we mentioned the homelessness, that one too many moves, one too many chaotic households, and the student just can't maintain. Did you want to say anything else?
Yeah, I also wanted to connect. So the suspension and serious academic failure unfortunately go hand in hand. So students who might be suspended for skipping or for a behavioral issue tend not to, they need academic support, but now they have an increased absence that is school sanctioned. And so when they come back to school, if they do, then they're even farther behind than when they left. And so that combination of suspension plus what is typically a lack of academic support for the duration of the suspension, whether it's in-school suspension or out of school, just means that the student will struggle even more academically if they return to school after the suspension period is over. So this one is really interesting. Of course, remember, we're asking just the young people what their perspectives were on some of the things that schools tried to do to thwart their skipping or behavior or academic struggles or whatever it might have been. And one of them I just started to allude to, which is the nonsensical intervention of in-school suspension or out-of-school suspension for skipping. So in a way, it's telling, if not rewarding the young person, it's telling them that it's okay to skip school. Also, most of the youth who experienced in-school suspensions received no academic support while sitting in a room. And so, as I mentioned, then when they were finally released from the in-school suspension and went back to class, they were even more behind than when they left. And in a really sequential class like mathematics, then that compounded the problem of them being behind in the first place.
Yeah, I'd be curious to know if school districts are still using this kind of punitive response to absences. When we first heard about the idea of students being suspended for skipping, we were a little skeptical, but it kept cropping up in the interviews. And then subsequently, when I asked at talks I gave whether this was still going on, a few hands were raised. I'm still wondering about that one. Another theme that came through loud and clear was that the students, although a few of them remembered heroic efforts on the part of schools and parents to try to get at the base of what was going on with them, very few remembered any kind of meetings with the school and parents. Surprisingly, since many of them, really virtually all of them, were skipping regularly by the 10th grade, almost just a handful remembered having been threatened with truancy court intervention. Not that we would embrace that as a good solution, but we found it strange. And rather, they just found that there was what they heard anyway from the adults was the focus on compliance as opposed to a focus on what's really going on with you. And finally, I just wanted to say a few words about when you kids can move through those phases of dropping out without a lot of intervention. It gives them time to embrace what we called a skipping identity. And that just simply means skipping is a social event. You rarely run into a kid who skips in a solitary way. They want to be with their peers. They find their other peers, and then together they form a skipping group identity. And the problem with that, of course, is that it helps reinforce the whole notion of like, oh, school is for losers, we're the cool kids. And then once you're kind of in that group and subscribing to that group's norms, it becomes very difficult. Kind of, it almost for me was reminiscent of the literature on gangs. When students talked about trying to leave skipping groups and re-engage with school, they encountered all kinds of pressure not to leave. The final issue about allowing kids to go far enough along a path that they embrace this identity is we found a very close connection between starting to skip and starting to engage in substance abuse, drug and alcohol, and even also going along with being out of school is engaging in criminal activities. So for all these reasons, trying to get in there early and prevent the kid from joining a skipping group and forming a skipping identity is really important.
So we've mentioned a few of the ELA, reading and writing, and social studies to a degree, factors that came up in the interviews. One is, it says good readers soured in middle grades. And what we found is, so we asked lots and lots and lots of questions about reading, perceived reading abilities, reading interests, and identity as a reader. And those did shift over time. The young people who said they were good readers, that tended to be in elementary school and in primary grades. And that really could be interpreted as, I was good at reading words. So they were good decoders of text. And then as they progressed into middle school, that phrase or that statement was replaced by reading got boring. And what that can be interpreted as is that reading got more difficult, and especially if we think of content area reading and having to read the math and the science and the social studies or history textbooks, that for some of these students that was probably too difficult for them. Those texts were too difficult for them to comprehend and to navigate successfully. Yeah. What?
Oh, I'm confused by reading as a way to escape school pressures. Is there something missing there?
No, I don't think so. So the good readers souring in middle grades, but then also I would say we asked students and the youth a number of times about what they remembered reading across different grades. And in elementary school, the students at that time tended to recall and really enjoy read aloud or shared reading experiences where the teacher is reading to or with them. As we know, that practice is much less common up through the grades. And then despite multiple questions, there was not a single young person we interviewed who could recall a single title of a book that they read in middle school. Later, reading, so in high school or after having dropped out, the young people could recall books that they had read recently. And what was interesting was that motivation or purpose for reading these texts became really important. So they would seek out information and read a book or a manual or whatever it was for a specific purpose. And there were also young people who, at this point in their lives, would read as a way to escape school pressures. And so they would read fantasy or sci-fi or even poetry as a way of getting away from their troubled world. But seldom were these readings connected to any kind of schooling experience. These were self-selected readings that were chosen by the young people, and so the motivation was there to read them. So it's very different from school reading. So, there's this divide that occurs the older that students get as they go through school. There is this increasing divide between sort of world literacy and the kinds of literacy practices that young people engage in every day, from texting to blogging, the numerous sources, to what it looks like to read in school, which tends to be reading a novel and talking as a whole group and then writing essays. And those two things are both literacy, but they have very little to do with one another unless they're really intentionally connected by the teacher. Also, that I'll never be able to do this work goes back to Carol Dweck's idea of mindset. And as readings got harder, then youth would just check out, especially if coupled with what I mentioned before, which is I hate reading out loud. If students were asked to read out loud from a book that they didn't understand, that was a devastating experience for them.
Could I add something there too, that one of the things that was so striking was that students who had all these fond memories recalling elementary school, one of the things they talked about is that when they ran into a problem or a difficulty, either the teacher or somebody else could give them a little bit of one-on-one time to get them over the hump. Once students got into middle school, their perception was that these kinds of individualized supports for when you ran into trouble virtually disappeared. Instead, it was kind of like, go to the library after school and see if you can get some help there. And the problem with that is that was often staffed by volunteers, and also by middle school and high school, students did not want to be identified as the students who had to go and get extra work. So that lack of support was another very major theme that carried through, especially for math and reading.
The young people also, in terms of the teaching methods, talked a lot about sort of that traditional model of sitting and listening to the teacher present information. And that was something that disengaged them rather quickly, so they would check out or skip. In contrast to that, a few students did mention more hands-on or experiential projects that they, even to the years later, to the point where when we interviewed them, they still remembered those vividly. So one of the youth we interviewed, a young woman, she recalled the time when the students had to kind of delve into history and create. So she created a diary that was supposed to be on old paper. So she dyed the paper with tea bag water and wrote in a special script and did all of this work to create this historical diary. And she talked about that vignette in detail. And another student whose narrative is in the book, her pseudonym is Trisha. She remembered going with her class on an extended trip to tour the Washington State Capitol, and could recall details not only of the trip, but of Washington State history connected to the trip in detail. Whereas other kinds of classes and things, when asked to recall them, she drew blanks. So that relates to that idea of challenging texts and, quote, boring classes.
We're going to run another poll and take some questions. So which statement best captures attitudes toward reading among students that you work with? And while we do that, we did have some questions from our audience. We're looking at Jocelyn's question. Did you see differences between the data for rural, urban, and suburban student demographics?
We did not have quite a large enough sample of if you think about dividing 53 by 3, it's hard to make any, to draw any strong conclusions. I would say that my impression was from the rural students that there were more issues around sort of the bullying school context tended to crop up pretty often.
All right, we also had a question. Were the student participants from a migrant or agricultural background?
Do you recall? Well, we certainly had a number of Latino students, but, and I remember specifically one student who had to move around a lot, but we did not, again, because our focus was primarily on what happened at school, what they told us about their background and home situation was what they chose to tell us.
Right. We also had the geographical constraint of needing to conduct the study within Western Washington, and reaching out to Eastern Washington communities couldn't be part of this study.
Mm-hmm. Did you see differences between English learners, current and non-English learners?
What do you think, Barbara?
I'm thinking that there may have been cultural differences that went on. Again, the students didn't talk about that, those kinds of experiences specifically.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm sorry, I can't answer that.
That's all right. Jen asked, I wonder if there is a way for systems to remove the stigma of being a super senior. Some students with disabilities need longer, and that should be okay. So do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, I'm thinking it goes even before that, I did not enter this study thinking this, but I have, upon completion of it, feel that if we really want to address the problem of students who become disengaged and drop out, and by the way, even though the graduation rates are now trending a little bit down, a little bit higher, that there's a whole layer of students who just managed to graduate by the skin of their teeth, who are extremely similar to the students that we interviewed. And so I came away with the conclusion that a good solid third of students in our public school system, there is a mismatch between what they need and what the system offers, and that we really need to look at restructuring, for example, our middle schools to so that we don't end up with the super senior. But I understand what you're saying. I think that requires such a deep dive into how we structure everything, because we don't have a problem with college students who have to take a semester or a year off for medical reasons, for example, or family reasons or mental health reasons. But for some reason, we have a very big problem with it when our high school students do have the same issues. And, you know, as I'm talking, I'm just thinking it's partly the metrics that we use. We have a 4-year and a 5-year metric and for graduation for the cohort. And that right there sets the bar.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Larry was wondering about these initiating points, the slide for initiating points. Mm-hmm. Are they hierarchical?
No, it's best thought of kind of a web of factors, and the initiating points can kind of happen at any time and sometimes in combination.
Also, I think we probably didn't make it clear enough that the youths themselves were able to identify the initiating and the tipping. They themselves thought, this is what got me started, this is what got me finished. So we're kind of taking their perceptions of what got them started and what got them finished.
Mm-hmm. All right, we're going to move on. Stop share.
Well, so we wanted to make sure to provide hope, because it's worth pointing out that almost all of these young people really enjoyed school at some point and really did want to succeed. So taking that knowledge plus the information that we presented, we have 3 principles that we present in the book for next steps for everyone from a classroom teacher to a policymaker. And the first principle is to understand the story behind the behavior, to just take that little bit of extra time to understand what is going on in the student's life. So if there's a consistent skipping pattern once that emerges, to sit down and really to listen to and understand the story behind that skipping behavior. And then that way that informs the kind of intervention or support that the student might need and really benefit from in order to build productive relationships and to succeed in school.
Yeah, a classic example of that is the kind of discipline policies that a school embraces, that if your policy doesn't include that step of first getting the story behind the behavior, you're missing a huge opportunity to problem solve with the youth, to create relationships, to create trust with that youth, because even though you have to hold a youth accountable for their behavior, there are other ways in which you can also embrace that youth through listening to them. Nowhere did we see this more clearly than with bullying, because frequently the victim would eventually lash out at their tormentors, and then they would get expelled or suspended. And of course they felt that this was tremendously unfair, but also there was a missed opportunity to help problem solve with that student.
Building on that is the importance of that sense of community and to foster a sense of belonging. So advisory periods, that is one example for creating a structure for students in middle school and high school to interact longer term with an adult and with a group of peers to help build a sense of community.
Another example that we encountered was that students who were highly mobile or had 1, 2, 3 moves and to different schools, there was this clear pattern of them feeling isolated and sort of like a loser. One student remembered sitting on a lunch bench by herself, and it was really sad, and wanting to call her mother and say, take me home, I can't stand this, because being isolated is just the worst thing for young adolescents. And so some schools have tried to institute programs specially for transfer students that don't require a lot of money, but require, say, a little bit of intensive connection with that transfer student, perhaps linking them up with a peer mentor, trying to do things to integrate them as quickly as possible into their new school community. Mm-hmm. Just another example.
And then with instructional approaches, really trying to meaningfully incorporate choice, even if it's a limited choice, into the content and approach to teaching would go a long way to boosting student engagement and motivation. It makes me think of this study by Gay Ivey and Peter Johnston, where they replaced the language arts curriculum in 8th grade with students reading of young adult fiction, and they could choose from a variety of books. And it not only boosted student engagement and motivation to the point where they were reading at lunch and also in their math and science classes, but it also did, for most students, increase their performance on tests of academic achievement. So choice is really something that's overlooked. The other is to get rid of some of the punitive practices. And in high school particularly, homework tends to be part of a grade for a course. And there are many reasons why students perhaps cannot complete homework outside of school. And some of those have to do with homelessness and equity issues, parental support for doing homework. Those are all things that can negatively impact a student's ability to complete homework outside of school. And then having that have a negative impact on their grade is another step toward that negative experience and possibly dropping out of school.
I think do we have any more? Oh, here's our here's our book.
Yes. If you do want to learn more about Deborah and Tony's work, their book is a really thought-provoking read that we've been passing around at OSPI this past year. So they have 2 case studies that might be of interest to you that they talked about a little earlier, Jack and Trisha's stories, and we have them linked here for you if you'd like to read them. They also have a summary document that has some of their big ideas if you want to share that around with your colleagues.
And also the narratives. For those of you who are interested in hearing the actual student voices, those are 2 narratives that we excerpted from the book.
Mm-hmm.
I also wonder, Tony, what do you think about this? Would we be able to take excerpts out of our final chapter, that because we don't really have time today to go into that, would we be able to send some excerpts from that, or without getting in trouble with our publishers?
Yeah, I think that would be helpful, because we just outlined the 3 principles, but in the book we have concrete and specific steps and ideas for each of those 3 principles to act upon.
Mm-hmm. I do want to acknowledge that it is 11 o'clock, so we're going to go over a little bit, but we did get a late start. For the Office of System and School Improvement, we are hoping that from this research, you can see the usefulness of having a systemic approach that has a nice aligned system that has some of the integrated supports of behavioral management and attendance, social, emotional, and achievement supports in mind, and they should all flow together, ideally. In the interest of time, we have created some system improvement guides that are really awesome. They are on attendance, 9th grade on track, and dual credit. These guides are designed for building and district leaders to use with their teams, and they include research-based best practices, rubrics for self-assessment, and action planning templates. We're really excited for people to use them. They are a great starting place for thinking about your system as a whole. We also have OSSI's website. We want to encourage you to use the green button there to get personalized support from our team. We'd love to work with you this year. So if you have questions for us, or if you just need a little extra something, we are here for you. We have a survey that we use to kind of guide the changes that we've made to our show over the years. Your responses mean so much to us. So if you take the time to fill out that GATE evaluation, that is very, very helpful to changing how our show runs. We do have some exciting upcoming events. September Attendance Awareness Month is happening, and OSPI is offering posters and pop sockets for phones. So if you'd like to get those materials, they are there, and I believe we're going to paste some of these into the chat so that you can get the links. There's also an upcoming webinar on the changes to the attendance rules, and to get support. So that includes migrant and foster care program staff, and that's coming up. And this next month, for in September, we have GATE Advisory. We're also going to be talking about attendance there, building engagement and removing barriers, and that's going to be in Olympia at ESD 113. And the GATE webinar for next month is going to have attendance assessing Tier 1 supports, and we're starting a new and exciting afternoon show. So the rest of this year, we're going to have a bonus webinar from 1 to 2, focusing in on a specific student group or diving deeper into our topic for that month. So next month, we're going to look at Minding the Gap, attendance supports for students with disabilities. And we're also really lucky. We have some of our ESD partners putting together groups so that they can listen in to GATE webinars and discuss them together. So if you're interested in joining one of those groups, get in touch with your ESDs. I know ESD 105 is a front runner and they're doing a really great job. So thank you, ESD 105, for listening in and using our resources. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a great Wednesday.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.